In reading this story here together, I can't help but wonder what stories of storms and strong winds come to your mind, maybe literally or metaphorically. I do need to acknowledge that I know that our text doesn't explicitly say that it was storming with rain and thunder and lightning, but the description of the high winds and the image of the boat being battered by the waves definitely includes an image of rain for me. And just out of curiosity, I did do a Google image search of this story last night, and it was about 50-50 of the images that had rain and that did not, so Google wasn't even sure if there was rain or not. One of the first things that comes to mind for me when I think of storms is how my beloved dog Marvel, yes, I'm a big superhero fan, is terrified of them. As soon as the first crack of thunder hits, she becomes incredibly anxious and scared and often hides under my bed. I do everything I can to comfort her, including giving her plenty of treats, even putting on her special thunder shirt, and providing plenty of snuggles and extra pets to try to help her get through it. Another story that comes to mind for me is how just this past Friday I texted my sibling who was on their anniversary trip with their wife in Aruba, and I was just checking in. It had been a couple days since I'd last texted, and I was desperate for some gorgeous photos of that clear blue water. Minutes after I texted, my sibling called me, and when they call me, they hate the phone, I immediately pick up. I know it's important. And they shared these very scary and harrowing details of a storm that they had been caught in just hours before. My sister-in-law had to drive them for over an hour through a total downpour that flooded the streets in minutes. My sibling shared that then when they had finally made it back to their Airbnb, the front license plate had been bent up from the waters swirling around the car. Absolutely terrifying, and I'm just so thankful that they are okay. Lastly, and I don't know about Austin, but back in Philadelphia where I come from, we have not had much rain in the last month and a half. There's been so little rain that in many counties in the area around me, they're on burn bans, so they can't burn anything outside or have a campfire or anything because of how dry it is. We definitely need that rain. So for me right now, there's this total mix of stories and emotions that come up when I think of storms and high winds. I think how scary they can be for dogs and humans alike, but also how vital rain is for all life on Earth. I wonder what stories come to mind when you hear this story. Is there another story about a storm from the Bible that comes to mind? I wonder what different experiences you have had with storms. I wonder if you've ever been in a boat in the middle of a storm, or in your car like my family members. What if you were in this particular boat during this particular storm? I wonder how you would feel. I wonder how you would act. Natalie already hinted at this, kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but almost 7 years ago, I was a year and a half into my seminary program and sent an email to the one and only Natalie Webb about doing an internship with her at her then church in San Antonio. I was raised Baptist in North Carolina, and as I searched for answers to questions about what it meant for my body and my identity to be in the church and to be a person of faith, something I'm still searching for, I found myself studying religion in college, going to seminary, and I found myself desperate to do my field education with and to be mentored by a badass pastor, preacher, and human. As I started my internship with Natalie in the summer of 2018, we were in the midst of the implementation of a zero-tolerance policy, dictating that all migrants who cross the border without permission, including those seeking asylum, be referred to the DOJ for prosecution. Undocumented asylum seekers were imprisoned, and any accompanying children under the age of 18 were handed over to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which shipped them miles away from their parents. I could spend way too much time talking about how devastating, but also so impactful that summer was. But to summarize, I got to witness and serve alongside a pastor and a little Baptist church in San Antonio who saw the human faces, lives, and stories of people suffering at the hands of oppressive and dehumanizing policies. And I saw this pastor in this little church respond, yes, with prayer, but also with tangible resources like housing and food and legal counsel. And here I find myself in another Baptist church in Texas, feeling grateful for churches like yours that see the human faces, lives, and stories of people suffering at the hands of oppressive and dehumanizing policies, and responding with action, support, and compassion. Through feeding people in your community, supporting and caring for students and student groups, advocating for vulnerable and marginalized folks, and I know so much more than that. This work is good, and this work is exhausting. Leading up to our story today in Matthew, in the previous chapter, we have stories of Jesus teaching back-to-back parables as a way to share more about what the kingdom of heaven is like. After this extensive stretch of teaching, Jesus then decides to head back to his hometown, where he ends up being rejected by the people he grew up with. That is an experience that many of us, especially the trans and queer folks in this room and online, are all too familiar with. And it means a lot to me to know that Jesus knows how that feels too. Then, in chapter 14, we begin with the telling of this tragic death of John the Baptist. And after hearing about what happened to his friend, Jesus wanted some space and alone time. And the text tells us that he went to a deserted place by himself. But folks quickly found out where he was and came to him. And this is the incredible setting of Jesus feeding the 5,000. This work is so good, and this work is so exhausting. I don't know about y'all, but I can't help but resonate with Jesus a little bit here. He's teaching, he's facing rejection, he's navigating grief, he's feeding hungry people, and he's tired and wants some alone time. And this is where our story begins, with Jesus again sending his disciples off ahead, needing some alone time. He dismisses the crowd he just fed and heads up into a mountain by himself to pray. While Jesus is resting alone and praying, the disciples appear to be struggling a bit out at sea. And the text gives us this scene. They were being battered by waves, they were far from land, and the wind was brutal. And then, out of nowhere, in the midst of the waves and the rain, they see a figure that they can't make out. Is it a ghost? It's not a boat. So what else could possibly be out here above the water with us? So growing up, the way that I heard this story preached often focused on this moment. They're terrified, they don't know what's out there. And then they hear Jesus reassure them. And Peter asks Jesus to prove that it is him by allowing him to walk on the water. So Jesus calls him out, and Peter begins to walk. And then he starts to sink. And then Jesus rebukes him for his lack of faith and pulls Peter and himself into the boat. The storm comes to an end, and the main point is brought home. Don't be like Peter. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Don't be afraid. Have stronger faith. But I have to wonder if it's okay to be afraid. I have to wonder if it is okay sometimes to just have little faith. In fact, I wonder if Peter would have still started to sink even if he had kept his gaze on Jesus, because something I do know about this world is that it is hard and scary things happen even in the moments when we feel as though our faith is strongest. And I don't know about y'all, but also walking on water in the middle of the sea feels like a really good time to be terrified. Keeping all these questions and thoughts in mind, I wonder if instead Jesus' question to Peter, "Why did you doubt?" was out of genuine concern or even an opportunity for self-reflection, not a stern rebuke. When I read this story, I picture Jesus' face so kind and compassionate, giving immediate attention to his friend in need, reaching out to grab him, gently asking, "Why did you doubt?" The reason why this question feels different to me than a stern rebuke is because we actually have an example of Jesus giving a stern rebuke to Peter. Later in chapter 16, we see this example. Jesus is explaining to the disciples that he will have to undergo great suffering and be killed, and then will be raised again on the third day. And Peter takes Jesus aside and says that these things cannot happen. And then Jesus' real rebuke comes in when he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Now that sounds like a real rebuke. So if Jesus wasn't rebuking Peter for his little faith and big doubts, and if this isn't a story about how Peter needed to have bigger faith and less doubt, what else might we learn from this story? Something interesting about the book of Matthew is the focus on the disciples and exploring what it means to be a disciple, what it means to follow Jesus. In fact, Matthew is the only gospel account of this story of Jesus walking on the water that even includes Peter in the story. So clearly, this interaction between Jesus and Peter is important to the author of Matthew. What can we learn about following Jesus from this passage? Jesus clearly loves and accepts and helps Peter in the midst of his doubts and fears, perhaps even further evidence that doubt is not a bad thing. We know this because Jesus doesn't hesitate. The text says Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. I wonder if Jesus' question is actually a recognition that there are reasons to have fears and doubts in life, and as a way to create space to have a conversation with Peter about that, he asks him, "Why did you doubt? I'm curious, tell me, let's talk." Or perhaps even more generally, we could understand this question as, why do you doubt? Jesus doesn't say stop doubting, instead he gently asks, why do you doubt? Why do we doubt, friends? Isn't doubt a part of what it means to be followers of Jesus? Something really interesting about this passage, sorry for a quick little nerd moment, is that this particular word for doubt actually only shows up in its original language, Greek, a total 2 times in the entire book of Matthew, here in chapter 14 and in Matthew 28, the famous Great Commission passage. This is a total coincidence as I chose this passage in the sermon to preach today. But speaking of my internship with Natalie almost 7 years ago, the first sermon I actually ever preached, this was even before I'd taken my preaching classes. That summer I preached on Matthew 28 in the Great Commission. In Matthew 28, Jesus had been raised from the dead, and the message has been passed along to the disciples. They are told by Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to meet Jesus. And then our English translation reads, "And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." That same verb to doubt in Greek, as we found in our passage here today, is here. And with this translation in Matthew 28, we are given 2 separate groups of disciples. It's almost as if it's like there's this one group over here worshiping Jesus, and then there's this other group doubting. I wonder if it is just as likely that we could imagine just one group of disciples simultaneously worshiping and doubting, because there's so much flexibility in the Greek language. That's why it's really fun to study and look into. And the word for but there could also just mean and. When they saw the risen Christ, they worshiped and doubted because they were seeing someone raised from the dead. This idea connects really well with our passage today as we look a little closer at what's going on with Peter as he tries to walk on water. We read that he noticed a strong wind and became frightened and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." It looks to me that Peter was simultaneously doubting and putting his faith in Jesus to help him. Through Jesus' actions of saving Peter and his words, "Why do you doubt?" I wonder if we too can learn that our love and care for others often happens in the midst of moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. What if to love and live like Jesus, we are supposed to just grab someone's hand and make space for their doubt, their fears, their questions. Make space for our own doubt and fears and questions. Are we able to meet each other here in that space of vulnerability without judgment? Are we, like Jesus, able to hold someone's hand and simply meet them in their place of doubt? Or like Peter, are we able to learn how to exercise and express our little faith in the midst of our fears and doubts? Friends, this work is good, and this work is exhausting. When reading this story, it can be so easy and interesting to focus on the dramatic tale of the storm and the walking on water and pointing out Peter's faults, all while missing this moment of connection. This moment of reaching out and catching a friend's hand and pulling them back in the boat. So here's my retelling of the story. So Peter, unsure if God was there because maybe it was a ghost, took a risk. While taking a risk and doing a hard thing, Peter got scared and began to struggle. Peter then asked for help from his friend. His friend, after taking some time to himself, was able to show up and help his friend and ask him, "What's going on?" That's the Deborah translation. This work is good, and this work is exhausting. Peter and Jesus meet here in this moment of connection, in this moment of care and support. Peter meets Jesus here in this moment of connection after being on a boat in the middle of a storm, unsure if God was there, taking a risk, feeling scared, having doubts, beginning to sink, and crying out for help. Jesus meets Peter here in this moment of connection after working and teaching, after facing rejection, grieving, resting, feeding the hungry. It is from this moment of, again, taking some time to be alone, that Jesus is able to do the next thing, that he is able to hear his friend ask for help, immediately take his hand and pull him into the boat. This work is good, and this work is exhausting because we need to rest and we need each other. Friends, whatever comes next, as we seek to feed the hungry, as we seek to protect the vulnerable, there is also space for your doubts, for your little faith, for moments when you're unsure if God is there, and for your need to rest. But let us stay connected to each other. For the storms we are in right now, the storms that are to come, the storms that scare us and make us want to hide under the bed, and the storms that nourish the earth, whatever the future holds, we can't do it alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.